Okay, so welcome everybody and happy Earth Day. The title of my talk this morning is one, and it's a talk that I've actually given here before, and Joyce asked me to repeat it. I gave it here a couple of years ago. It's called My Forest, My Home, Lessons in Sustainability. You know, I have personally long felt a really spiritual, close connection with the trees, with the forests. And I guess it may have started over 30 years ago, 35 years ago now, when I first visited a famous place called Muir Woods. It's out near the San Francisco Bay. Has anybody ever been there? A good number of you have been, so you understand what I'm talking about. And on that first time I visited, it was late in the day, and I was pretty much alone because of that, because of the season, as I began to walk through those redwood trees, between them and up through the path. There's just incredible giants I'd never experienced before. And I recall that I stopped frequently to touch these trees, and being alone and touching them, and I swore that I could feel something flowing. It was like an energy flowing in them. And it was kind of coursing under the bark. And I was amazed, and I was a little freaked out as well. And I attributed all of that perhaps to the fact that I had visited maybe a dozen Napa wineries earlier in the day. And there was sampling that went on. But I have visited Muir Woods, I must say, at least 3 times after that, including almost a year ago. I visited out there again walking by myself at an early morning time before crowds were there. And in each time in that hallowed place, I've had that same experience. So it's real, it was real. The wood that comes from these great forests, I think, has long held my whole life. For instance, it's been nearly 57 years since I started putting a violin at my heart. And that's many pieces of wood made of ash and maple and walnut and different kinds of woods that come together. And it's been probably nearly 13 years ago since I started playing cello and holding those pieces of wood and letting that vibration feel in my gut and in my chest. It feels more like home in my log cabin here in the woods in Tiger than any place I've ever lived in my life. I feel surrounded by the forest in so many ways. It's really important to me. It's where I live here in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, over 70% of our land here in this county, called Rabun County, is national forest. That means we own it. It's ours, and it is our home, and it's why most of us are here. And it was about a year and a half ago that big chunks of that forest burned. And some of you were here to experience that. It wasn't attributed to Mother Nature. It was arsonists. And how can you imagine someone burning our woods? The sadness, the pain that they must feel in their own hearts to feel a need to do that and to take pleasure from that. I just can't get it. A lot of people focused on the power of Mother Nature during that time. It was pounding at the door, and rightly so. Some of our friends, some of your friends, had to actually leave their homes, and they counted the days staying with some of us who had to put them up for shelter while they wondered whether they were going to have a home to go back to or not. Others who regularly hiked the trails of places like the Upper Tallulah River and the Standing Indian in North Carolina, the Appalachian Trail nearby off of 76, and many other places, they lamented for the trees. They weren't sure if they were going to come back again. And they lamented also the forest floor that everything was rooted in. Now, fortunately, the actual fires, they stayed low, and they remained mostly feeding the underbrush. So the actual trees didn't have a lot of damage, and it all came back. But there was a big mess. There was a big mess from the fire roads that were created to deal with this and to stop and to protect us. And that did shock our senses. But we lived on, and so has our forest. But those events gave new focus and appreciation, I think, to a lot of us who feel like this forest that surrounds us is our home. And I think that's a good thing. On a gut level, a lot of people recognize that the forest has a magical quality. And in the past, I've talked to this place and others about some of the Celtic beliefs and their traditions, and how the Celts knew that the rivers and that flowed through the forest and the forest themselves, that they were special places of what we call divine presence, perhaps a gathering place for spirits even. And they knew not to intrude on these places and never to desecrate these places. And even today, the United Nations has designated special sacred groves of trees around the world, special places that are recognized and meant to be protected by the UN World Heritage List because of their special spiritual presence and their ecological value as well. They have a lot of significance, and we find these places not just here in the States, but there's places like these forests in Japan and Australia and the Philippines and Kenya that have been designated and recognized because of how much it means to the people who live there and the people who visit. And so many of the religious traditions that we hear about have long recognized that, again, that connection between the forest, the trees, and our spiritual growth. For example, the Nordic mythology about the ash tree is a symbol for the world's axis. And how long did the Buddha sit under the Bodhi tree before he was enlightened? A long, long time. And how long have we honored the tradition of the Christmas tree? A pretty long time. Forest is a space that caters, I think, to our need for quiet and connection with the earth. And time spent there, I think, strengthens our connection with nature and the principles of life. And it sometimes feels like there are even messages when we listen to those tall pines or the other tall trees here. And Joyce and I were speaking earlier this week, and she said when the wind comes through, especially at this time of year, and the leaves are so much smaller, and it's a different kind of sound that you can only hear in certain moments at this time of year. It's very unique. It's a spring wind sound through those trees. And I personally find the forest a place that's really conducive to learn things like patience and kindness and honesty and responsibility and humility. And these are core values that are part of our spiritual life. There's also the physical nurturing that happens when we have that encounter, that constant encounter with the forest, that exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. And there's also that miniature world that lives at the foot of the trees, that are really part of the trees as well. It's not just the bark and the leaves and the branches. It's so important, that hidden community of decaying wood, the fungi, the beetles, the tiny soil microbes that transform matter and are so important to the health of the whole forest and our own health. And those of you who have practiced yoga, who's practiced yoga here? Who knows how to do the tree pose? Ah, everybody. Well, think about, if you ever practiced yoga in the tree pose in a forest, it has a special significance because it enhances your mental stability and the health, your own health. The tree of life also has long had a place in just about all of the world's religions. I was reminded of that yesterday when I was going through an art area, and there were a lot of different symbols of the tree of life that someone had done art with. It represents the binding of heaven and earth, and represents that vital connection that we feel between the world of the gods, or God, and humans. Most people today don't go around worshiping trees, although some do still. But there is an organization that I've been involved in for probably nearly 12 years called Georgia Forest Watch. And it's been kind of the watchdog for the forests up in our neck of the woods, so to speak. It advocates to the Forest Service for more sustainable forest management. It teaches that the public owns this forest. It's our tax dollars. It's ours. And it speaks up on issues and government decisions about clear cutting and forestry, intentional burning, the application of chemicals in our forests and forest roadways. And there's a lot more chemicals going into the forest, believe it or not. It kind of speaks for the trees. All of this membership and being involved in that organization led me on a path to learning a lot more about the science of the forest and the history of the forest and the trees here, and how things were really mismanaged for a long time, and all of our trees were clear-cut in Rabun County. Go to the Historical Society and see pictures of how it was. Also about the introduction of invasive species that have such an impact. We've tried to eliminate here in our little piece of the forest around the chapel the invasive species, and Joyce and her team has worked so hard on that. But also on issues like soil erosion and depletion as a result of the different mankind activities. It's taught me how to be more conscious of these things. But you know, it doesn't take a scientist, and it doesn't even take an adult to understand these issues. I want to share with you a book. It's called The Lorax. Has anybody ever read The Lorax before? A few of you have. It's a Dr. Seuss book. The Lorax, for those of you who don't know about it or don't remember because it's been a long time, The Lorax is the story of a place called Thneedville, which once flourished with wonderful trees called truffula trees, until a fellow came to town and he was called the Onceler. The Onceler discovered that the tops of these truffula trees, as you see a picture here, could be used to manufacture a most desirable product called a thneed. Now, a thneed to him represented money, and he talked about how it could enrich the people in Thneedville. So this fellow called a Lorax stood up and said, "Whoa, wait a minute." He raised an awful racket when the Onceler started cutting down these truffula trees. But the Lorax was ignored because money was pretty important to them, and they saw prosperity coming. Well, the Lorax left town, and you know the rest of the story. Eventually the truffula trees were all cut down, and there was nothing left but one seed. And the Thneeds left for greener pastures, for more places to make money, and Thneedville was decimated. It was never the same. I'd not thought about that story about the Lorax for many, many years until the manager of a pulp and paper company that I was doing some business with, I think it was up in Maine at the time, he spoke proudly about how his company planted 3 trees for every one they cut down. And I thought, that sounds pretty good. 3 for 1, not a bad deal. Until a friend with Georgia Forest Watch turned me on to a TED Talk. And it was a TED Talk by a woman named Dr. Susan Simard. And it was called How Trees Talk to Each Other. Now, Simard was trained as a forester. And for a long time, she worked with companies that harvested trees in Canada. But there came a time early in her career where she began to question all of this, especially the clear cutting that she saw being done. It didn't sit right for her. So she quit working for that company, and she moved to university work and forest research. And she knew about some laboratory research that showed that seeds in a laboratory, seeds from a tree in a laboratory, sitting together, there can actually be an exchange of carbon dioxide between those seeds. One seed had it, one seed needed it, and they would cooperatively pass it on. That was remarkable. And she wondered, well, what happens in nature? This is a laboratory. So she decided to take her research out into the field, into the forest. To make a long story short, she set up test stands in the forest with birch and fir and cedar, and she used radioactive tracer chemicals. And she was able to learn that a tree in a forest is really part of a larger family that has chemical communication between the trees. And it was a network. And in that network, they were actually transferring carbon dioxide to meet the needs of the ones that needed it. She also discovered that this happened between different species of trees. It wasn't just one family, the firs between the firs or the cedars between the cedars. And she replicated her experiments all over different forests in Canada. And she learned that there was a world of infinite biological pathways that connect the trees. Again, we're going to the ground here. In such a way that they began to behave, they did behave as a single organism. She called it some sort of an intelligence that was happening. You see, that palette of roots and soil is the foundation of the forest, and it's called the mycorrhiza. It's roots fungus and mushrooms, and those threads form what they call a mycelium. And that spreads and spreads, and it affects and colonizes the roots, and it makes that connection. It's almost like a highway of connection in the forest itself. And there's trading of carbon, and there's trading of different kind of chemicals and nutrients in that dense web that connects all the individuals in the forest. And scientists have actually been able to map out the DNA of a given forest and shown that connection. That's pretty exciting. So trees share information below ground. And they've also discovered that there's a thing called hub nodes. These are what you might consider mother trees that are nurturing the young trees in the forest. And the mother trees have hundreds and hundreds of younger trees and seedlings, and they nourish those seedlings by that connection. They also learned that when a mother tree is injured or dying, it's going to send messages to the next generation of trees. It sends information that includes defensive signals to help them protect themselves and live on. It's fascinating. I'm not going to say trees talk, but it kind of sounds like they're communicating, doesn't it? And that helps increase the resilience of the whole community. So Dr. Susan Simard pointed out the danger of clear cutting and taking out the large hub trees, the mother trees. And she asked a lot of really good questions. She really dug deep using science to find the answers, and her conclusions about the sustainability of the forest, I think, and its capacity to heal, maybe send some messages to us. First of all, she said, forests are really complex systems, and they have an enormous capacity to heal, and with patch cutting and the retention of the hub trees instead of clear cutting, they can really recover rapidly if you do it right, good forestry. She also advocated local involvement in our forests. Different local conditions are going to be different. Our forests are different than the forests in New Mexico, or even in Missouri, or Arkansas. They're going to be different. So people understanding that's important. She said we need to save our old growth forests because they're the repositories and the depositories of the genes for the forest, the mother trees and those mycorrhizal networks, that fungal network, so that they can pass down their defenses. And fourthly, when we replant, there needs to be a diversity of species allowing natural regeneration. Because forests aren't a bunch of, or a patch of trees competing with each other. They're families. She talked about sustainability, and because it's the property of biological systems to remain diverse and productive indefinitely, on and on and on. That's what sustainability means. Long-lived and healthy. So why am I sharing this information with Wayfarers, besides the fact that you all live in the forest with me? Well, we all need to ask questions, I think, about sustainability as well, and what needs to be sustained. From a human point of view, I think we need to think about sustainability also, and it means meeting basic human needs without destroying or degrading our environment or the resources that help us meet those needs. It implies being responsible and proactive in decision-making and being innovative and using the science and using the spirit that we have here. I'm not suggesting a call to arms about issues. That's not what we're about here. But I ask you to consider the concept of sustainability as it applies to each of us individually and us in a community that sits right here, right now as well. I suggested earlier that there are, I think, some core values of living, not just spiritual living, living for a rich life. Values like patience and kindness and honesty and responsibility and humility and diligence. And I mentioned that my time in the forest has begun for a long time to foster those things and remind me when I lose my way. I think time spent in this chapel has done the same thing. It's added to those lessons. And so as I look at you wayfarers here and think about the wayfarers that aren't here, and are maybe even going to listen to this later, it reminds me of how I'm sustained by this place and how you are sustained as well. We receive nourishment of the human connection and learning the spiritual lessons of different speakers and different sharing amongst us. We receive the meditation and the music, the loving friendships, and the opportunity to give back. And giving back strengthens those connections, just like in the forest. Also realize that it takes a lot of work and is going to continue to take a lot of work to sustain this place and this community. And I'm reminded of the lessons that Dr. Simard had in that regard, where she gleaned time from her time in the forest. Number one, our communication network here is very important. We talked about the need for the newsletter and the critical piece of that. But we have also our new website. We have time spent before our Sunday time and after to increase that communication, to share information and concerns and ideas. And our network is strengthened by those interpersonal relationships that we really need to foster and keep healthy. We have a complex web of communication, and it needs to be safe, open, and consistent, and constant, and lively in order to be healthy, just like the trees. We need to be tuned in when our saplings are under stress. We've all got to be willing to listen deeply to those around us. Listen to the rhythms. Feel those rhythms. You can feel it when somebody's hurting or has a need or something's a little off kilter. I know when I come here and I get these great hugs, it just centers me and lets me go on for days after. So we also have to be prepared to offer nourishment when there is a need, by listening, prayer time, holding hands, even food for a place to lay down one's head when that need is there. Every wayfarer here and beyond needs to know that that's okay. Diversity is important if we're going to be strong. Diversity of ideas and approaches and ages and perspectives. All of that is key to having wayfarers around another 30 or 60 years, long beyond us here. Just as diversity allows the forest to naturally regenerate. And finally, we have to support the mother tree. And I kind of consider this the mother tree for us, this place. We need the ideas and the times and the talents and the sweat and the calluses and even the financial support sometimes from everyone who values this place, as we do, and wants the doors to stay open, and the community to continue sustaining our spiritual place. And so with that said, enjoy your Earth Day, and I know I will, and continue to enjoy this place and maybe walk the labyrinth later today. Thank you.